Ashley Taylor was a young woman from Nebraska. She went traveling after she finished college. She ended up staying in England, and on May 5th, 2009, after going through a relationship breakdown and losing her job, Ashley left the English city of Manchester and drove deep into the rural South Wales. Little did she know that the harrowing events that were about to unfold there, they would change her life forever. This is Ashley's account of her horrifying events given to the reporter Carly Hayton in Lincoln, Nebraska on October 9th, 2009. It all started in springtime. That's when my life started to unravel. It had all been great before then. I thought the UK was where I belonged, was where I'd build my career, and eventually start a family. It all came crashing down around me. I lost my partner, my job, everything. I just wanted to get away from the city at that point that I'd come to loathe. I had some severance pay from work, and I considered using it to book a plane ticket back home, but I hesitated. I knew my family would smother me, and I wasn't in the headspace to deal with "I told you so." I was looking online when this advert popped up for this property in the countryside. It was this beautiful thatched roof cottage. It reminded me of Aurora's cottage in Sleeping Beauty. I loved that movie as a kid. I couldn't believe the price. It was so cheap. It was like it was meant to be. So I messaged them and I asked for more information. I received an email back almost instantly. In it, they told me that due to personal circumstances, they left the area, and as a result, they'd prefer to have someone occupying their cottage than not, hence this cheap rent. I impulsively agreed to a month-long stay and I transferred over the deposit. And then they messaged me back telling me that due to the remote location, the postcode wouldn't come up on any GPS. So they sent me some directions from the closest town, which was about 20 miles away. There was one more thing. This person didn't give me their number or include their full name. Instead, they signed everything with the letter N. Even their email address was cryptic and just included the name of the cottage, Ivy Cottage. I had guessed that they were just a private person or something, and I didn't question it further at the time. I packed up my car that same evening and I drove through the night. At the time, I was just relieved to be out of the city. So once I was off the main road and following my mystery landlord's directions, I didn't give much thought to how different suddenly my new surroundings seemed. Even in the darkness of night, I could tell that the dirt roads appeared to grow narrower. It felt like they would just span on forever. Blurs of never-ending green. All of the roads looked the same, and my GPS had stopped working ages ago, and I was just driving aimlessly. At that point, I really regretted driving out there, as it was going dark, and cursed myself for being so dumb. I couldn't even park somewhere and wait until morning. These roads were so darn narrow. That's when I saw them behind me. Headlights. I hadn't seen another car on the road since I'd passed the last town. Still, it stood to reason that other people actually lived out here too, so I continued driving. Only this vehicle gained on me and began frantically flashing their lights, beeping their horn. There was nowhere to pull over, and the roads were far too narrow for them to pass. So I sped up and drove around the narrow roads at a very uncomfortable speed. I was actually freaking out. I mean, they were in such a hurry and I didn't know this area. I didn't know what I was meant to do. By the time this narrow road ended and spread out to a cluster of fields, I sighed in relief and immediately pulled over to let this vehicle behind me pass. I thought they'd zoom past, but to my horror, they did not. Now I felt sick with dread as they pulled up alongside me, then wound the window down and looked at me. In this faint light, I could just make out that the driver was a young man, and someone was sitting next to them, another man of a similar age. Their boxy red car was dusty, old and beat up, and there was a new sticker on the door. It looked like a skull with a snake coiled around it. I couldn't tell for sure. The driver looked directly at me with this sinister gaze and laughing, said, "It's our salvation. It's Nusquam." And that's the first time I ever heard that word. Back then, I had no idea what it meant, the horror it entailed. If I'd known more then, I would have turned around and left that place. I would have left before it infested my mind. At this point, I double-checked my doors were locked. As I saw it, I was in the middle of nowhere, and some lunatics who'd not only nearly driven me off the road, but were now shrieking a nonsense word at me. So much for escaping the mayhem of the city. The driver looked at me. He laughed, and then he drove off. I watched them go until they were out of sight and sound, and I calmed myself down. I rechecked all my directions, and I continued on my way, more determined than ever to find that cottage, as no chance I was staying out there with those crazy men driving around. I drove past the sign for it at first, just a tree slice sign with dripped black letters on it, Ivy Cottage, but in the corner of the sign was something else. This smudged drawing of some sort. I couldn't make it out in this limited light, so I reversed and I drove up this bumpy lane. It was everything I imagined, as much as it wasn't. This cottage with this thatched roof surrounded by wildflowers and gnarled trees. The key was left as specified beneath the red plant pot. I let myself in and then had a quick look around this cottage before I went back to my car to get the rest of my stuff. I just wanted to lock myself inside for the night and leave it at that. And that's when I saw her. This shadow in the night, a woman about 50 with straggly, long gray hair, was peering through the open door into my car. Seeing her unnerved me, and I spluttered out, "Excuse me." The woman stepped back and turned and smiled at me. She didn't seem surprised by my presence at all. She gave me this forced smile, actually, and said, "So you're the new girl." Without waiting for me to even answer, she continued, "I live in the farmhouse over there." She pointed right behind her. "We like our privacy, so never drive up the red gated lane. If you need us, write a note and put it under the rock by the gate, and we'll get back to you shortly. You understand?" By this point, I just wanted to go inside, lock the doors, and escape the weirdness of this place. So I nodded at her and I muttered out, "Okay." My answer seemed to satisfy this woman, as she said something under her breath that I didn't make out, and then she walked off. I watched her shuffle up this lane with no flashlight or source of light. There were no other vehicles around, so she must have walked this way in the dark. I was too tired to ponder on how freaky this was, so I quickly unloaded my car and I locked myself and my stuff inside. Home, sweet, weird as hell home. It may have been crazy outside, but inside this cottage was just what I needed. Granted, it was worn in places and it needed a good dust, but it was away from the rest of the world. And that's when I spotted it among the pile of my stuff. A pointed stone, palm-sized. On it was a picture, one that made me gasp on seeing it. A snake coiled through a skull, just like the one on those men's car door. I didn't know how that stone got in amongst my stuff, unless that woman put it there. I used a sweater to pick it up and chucked it through the window into a bush. I thought that was it, that was the last of it, but I was wrong. This was only the beginning. For the next few days, it rained, so I didn't go beyond the cottage perimeters. A few times, I swear, I saw a shadow flit beyond the trees that surrounded the cottage, but I just tried convincing myself this was caused by the weather. Still, I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched, and on one occasion, I looked out of the window and was sure. For a split second, I saw a pair of dark eyes staring back at me, right there from behind the tree trunk. I told myself I was imagining things and I blamed it on pure stress. I closed the curtain so I couldn't torment myself with the outside world anymore. I shut myself right off for those next few days. Eventually, being cooped up inside started getting to me. So on one placid day, I decided to venture out of the cottage and explore this area. On walking up the lane, I finally got to inspect this drawing on the sign. In daylight, despite it being smudged, I still made out exactly what it was. A snake coiled around a skull. Only this wasn't drawn in black like the rest of the sign. It was smudged red, and next to it was a small X. At that moment, I heard shuffling in the overgrowth right behind me, and this crow flew out at me. Red eyes. I remember its red eyes. It squealed as it flapped its wings past my head. I shielded my head with my hands and emitted a scream, but when I looked up, there was no sign of any crow. I convinced myself I needed fresh air, that being cooped up had really gotten to me, so I walked along those quiet country roads. I walked and I walked, noting the silence, noting the peace, thinking about it now. I didn't hear any animals or insects. There was just a stillness, a silence. I've been walking for about 20 minutes when I tripped over something and only just managed to steady my fall. I looked down and I saw what I tripped on. It was a mangled black biker boot, my size, a woman's. Leather was scuffed and the laces, there was something on them. I bent down and I touched it, and this sticky red substance rubbed onto my fingers. I flinched in disgust and rubbed my fingers on my shirt. It didn't make sense that someone had lost a boot out there in the middle of nowhere. I left that boot where it was and I carried on walking, my head now full of more questions than answers. I eventually came to it, a dirt road with a red gate. I could make out the farmhouse up ahead. This must be where that crazy woman lived. I was looking down at that rock by the gate when I heard a bang. I looked up and I saw a fog of smoke coming up near the farmhouse, followed by what I could have sworn were screams. Panicked, I didn't know what to do. The woman told me never to go up to that farmhouse, but what if there was something really wrong? So I climbed over the gate and I hurried up the long lane. To the side of the farmhouse was a field, and I noticed how surrounding it was barbed wire fence, at least 6 feet high, and tangled in it were clumps of what looked like bloody cloth and hair, and it was truly horrific. I should never have trespassed, and I knew I needed to get out of there. I turned around ready to run, until I was back to the cottage, and that's when I heard something. Footsteps. I didn't think, I just reacted. I quickly hid somewhere, the side of a barn. My heart was in my throat and my head was fuzzy with fear as I forced myself to peer around the side of the barn. I saw that a man, 50-ish, his back was to me and he was whistling as he pushed a wheelbarrow with a dark sheet over it. I kept on watching, mesmerized with fear. As he bumped the wheelbarrow along, something tumbled beneath the sheet. It took me a few seconds to register what that was, and when I did, I wished more than anything that I could unsee it. Hanging out of it was a bloody, mauled, limp arm. I gasped out and immediately placed my hand over my mouth. The man stopped whistling and came to a halt. He peered around him, then proceeded to stick the arm under the sheet before he continued on his way. I know what I saw. This place, that man. It was all so messed up. I tried to work through my frantic mind and figure out what am I supposed to do here. I didn't want to risk running into the man and becoming the latest victim to end up in his wheelbarrow, so I snuck into the barn to hide out for just a little longer. I looked around me with shocked confusion. It was full of vehicles, at least 30 of them, or at least what was left of them. Slashed tires, smashed windshields, dented bumpers, melted paintwork and door handles, and missing license plates. It was a vehicle graveyard, and I was in the middle of it. I saw this flash of red out of the corner of my eye, and I walked right over to it. The car was nothing more than a wreck now, but that color, it was the same as the one those men had been driving in on my first night driving here. Now, remembering the sticker on the driver's door, I went to look, and there was a faded patch of color right there, and a symbol was just about visible around this faded paintwork, a snake and a skull. I felt sick and I thought this was it, that I was going to be stuck there forever, that I was going to meet the same fate as the owners of those messed up cars. I heard a door opening, footsteps, whistling. It was a tune that sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. But I knew it was that man. He was gaining on me. I darted behind the car, held my breath and stayed as still as I could, as still as a mouse. I closed my eyes and I thought of somewhere else, of home. Then I realized something. That whistling had stopped. That's when I felt a hand grip my shoulder. I spun around expecting to see that man, expecting my life to be over. Only it wasn't him. And that's when I saw her. A woman covered in dirt. It stuck to every part of her. Dried and clumpy. I couldn't tell where her black dress ended and the dirt began. Both of her feet were bare, and through the mud I saw the cuts. Her one foot had a chunk missing from it, a mixture of mud and flesh. She must have been in agony, but she didn't show it. She was looking at me, glee in her eyes. I was frozen in fear. All I could do was look at her and silently pray she wouldn't hurt me. And then suddenly, she let go of my shoulder and she pressed a muddied finger to her lips, the fingernail missing from the nail bed, and an enlarged smile formed on her dirt-crusted face. And then she looked at me, just looked at me for seconds. Or minutes. I don't know. I don't know how long. And then she turned and walked off, dragging her injured foot as she went. With her back to me, I saw the fabric cut away on her dress, and there, on skin untouched by dirt, was a symbol freshly carved in her skin, a blood-crusted snake entwined in a skull. I stayed there stunned and afraid. I stayed there for I don't know how long. I kept thinking someone would come for me and hurt me like they hurt that woman. I kept thinking I'd walk into my own demise, but they didn't come. I must have fallen asleep, but I don't remember doing so. I don't remember leaving. The next thing I remember, I was staggering along the lane toward the red gate. The sky was darkening. This meant I had time missing. Hours. Hours I couldn't place. I'd been in the barn, that I was sure of. And then I was by the red gate, and looking down at that rock again, I made out a word carved on it. Nusquam. I heard that word before. The man in the car had shouted it. Did he come here? And was that really his car? If so, then where was he and his companion now? Were they to do with that woman? Is that why she had the same symbol from the car sticker carved into her back? What was this place? I don't know how I found my way back to the cottage, but I managed to. I thought about the bang, that bloody barbed wire, the limp arm, and vehicles. That woman. I was in the middle of nowhere, all alone, and with no signal on my phone. Then I headed toward the door and I saw it there, perched on the doorstep, that crow with those red eyes. I stared at it and it stared right back at me. It was only when I blinked my eyes and I looked again that it had gone. A pile of churned up worms and bile in its place, and a stone, that pointed stone with a snake coiled around the skull. The same rock I'd thrown in the bush on my first night there. If I didn't know it before, I knew it then. Someone was definitely messing with me. There was nothing I could do in the dark, and I was barely conscious. I couldn't leave like that. I made sure I'd locked up, and then I went to bed, adamant that I would leave at first light. I awoke to a thudding sound against my window, gradually increasing in rapidness. It caused me to wake up with a start. I put my bedside lamp on and I crept over to the window and I pulled back the curtains, afraid of what I would find, but not prepared for this. Pressed against the cracked glass was a blood-covered hand. Suddenly, this face appeared. A man's, bloodied and frantic, the right side sunken in more than the left. He looked straight at me, and then he opened his mouth and I saw that all the teeth on the right side were missing, a pool of blood and swollen gums in its place. He spat out some blood and splurted out a word. I didn't have to hear him properly to know what it was. Nusquam. His blood was dripping all over my window. He smudged it there with his own hand, tracing his finger through it, as though he was drawing something. He stuck his tongue out while he did this, a blur of grotesque pink in his ruined mouth. I grabbed a bread knife and a flashlight out of the kitchen and went around the back of the cottage. With each bare footstep, each squelch in the muddy ground, I thought he would jump out at me. I thought I would end up like him. I forced myself forward, around the side of the house, and there was no sign of the man, but I saw that bloody handprint on my bedroom window, and I shone the flashlight onto a splatter of ox blood-colored liquid glistening in the darkness on the symbol that he'd drawn there, a snake coiled in a skull. The man vanished. Terrified, I went back into the house and I grabbed my jacket, my phone, and my car keys, and then I got into my car and I drove out of there. I needed to leave this nightmare while I still could. Only a few miles into the narrow dirt road, I saw headlights coming toward me from the other direction. I could tell from the changing brightness and light that the vehicle was coming at a great speed. I didn't know what to do. There was nowhere for me to go, and in my panic state, there's no way I could reverse all that distance. I put on my emergency lights, but that car didn't slow down. Not knowing what else to do, I got out of it and I furiously waved my arms. The car came to a screeching halt right in front of me. A couple got out. A man and a woman, both wearing cargo trousers, hoodies, and baseball caps. They looked at me, threw me something, and then the girl laughed and said, "This is Nusquam." Before I even had a chance to register what was happening, they got into my car and began reversing away without a care. I looked at what they'd thrown at me. Car keys. So with little other option left, I got into their car and I drove after them. None of this made any sense, but I knew in my gut where they were going. I followed them there. I saw my car speed along the lane toward that farmhouse. I pulled up outside of that farmhouse and I stared up that driveway. I stepped out of the car and was trying to work out what to do next when I felt something crawling up my leg. I peered down and I saw something there. A cockroach. I shrieked and I flicked it away, but it wasn't alone. Scuttling beneath my feet were hundreds of these things. I kicked out my feet and I stumbled backward. Soon I was tumbling over into the mass of dirt and cockroaches. I tried to scramble back to my feet, but they crawled over my hands and my legs, even my face, everywhere. They were everywhere. I flinched my arm, and a cockroach flew through the air and landed upside down right by my side, and I could see on its underbelly, written in something red, was one single word, Nusquam. I left the car where it was, and I ran as fast as I could back to the cottage. I spent hours in the shower trying to wash all traces of those things off me. It felt like a bad dream, but it was real. It was happening. I could smell them. Even after washing, I smelled their decay. I didn't sleep that night, but even with the tiredness scratching at my brain, I knew that I couldn't stay in this unsettling place any longer. Knowing I had no other choice, at first light, I went to the red gate. There was no sign of the cockroaches, my car, or that couple. I quickly left a note beneath the rock, and in it I asked for a car so I could leave this place forever. 3 excruciating days passed. I was left rationing food and feeling anxious about what I should do next. I was trapped with no hope. When I heard a single knock on the door, I thought I must be imagining it. This calmness came over me as I opened it, though, and I saw the whistling man there. I should have been petrified, but nothingness. I felt this nothingness. He stood in front of my car, scratched and dented, but the engine was humming. He didn't smile or frown. In a still voice, he said, "You can't leave Nusquam, but you can try." I brushed past him and walked over to my car. I was just in a trance. At least that's what it felt like. But my mouth had other ideas, and I found myself asking him, "What is this place? What is Nusquam?" He fell silent for what felt like minutes, and then a smirk contorted on his face, and he replied, "Nusquam is nowhere. I left that strange place in the middle of nowhere with none of my stuff. I didn't look back, not once. I drove straight through the next town and didn't stop till the one after that, and then I messaged the landlord, saying I was vacating that cottage early, but the email bounced back. And that's not the only weird thing about it. All previous emails they'd sent me, including the one containing the directions, had weirdly disappeared from my inbox. So I left that country and I came home to Nebraska. But what happened there, it came with me. It still crawls on my skin. It latches to my mind. I know I have to go back, but I don't want to. But it left its mark on me. The man was right. I can't leave Nusquam. The only thing I'm sure of now is that Nusquam is nowhere. Throughout her conversation with the reporter, Ashley was anxious, distracted, and quite restless. Before she left Carly Hayton's house, she pulled back her hair and showed her something self-carved on the side of her neck. It was a symbol of a snake coiled around a skull. She became hysterical and admitted to carving it herself with a compass. Ashley fled before Carly could ever help her. The last recording sighting of her was on October 11th, 2009 at Cardiff Airport, Wales, United Kingdom. There have been no reported sightings of her since, and that cottage and farmhouse that Ashley spoke of have never been found. But on investigating, the police found proof of a deposit being wired from Ashley's account to an untraceable source under the reference name Ivy Cottage. What truly happened to Ashley Taylor all those years ago remains a mystery, one lost to an unknown place, leading to nowhere. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.